Please call that.
The office next to Paul Eason line.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to the New York City Water Board's Upstate rate hearing for fiscal year 2015. My name is Greg Acerto, and I will be the hearing officer today. And before we start the presentation and the public testimony, I have several exhibits to read into the record. The first is Exhibit 1, which is the designation of a hearing officer. The second exhibit is the public notice of this hearing. Exhibit 3 is the affidavit of publication of that notice. And Exhibit 4 is a copy of the notice that was published on the Water Board's website. We also have Exhibit 5A, which is the Upstate rate report. It's titled "The Report on the Cost of Supplying Water to Upstate Customers for Fiscal Year 2015. We have Exhibit 5B, which is the transmittal letter of that report. And then we received some written testimony. The first is labeled Exhibit 6A, which was submitted by the Village of Scarsdale, the Water Superintendent, Tony Capicato. And then we have Exhibit 6B, which is the testimony of Michael Pointing, the Vice President of United Water, New Rochelle. And Exhibit 6C, which is the testimony of Joel Victor Law. If anyone else would like to submit written testimony, it can be submitted at today's hearing, or it can be mailed or emailed to the board by 5 p.m. on Thursday, June 12, 2014. Please send the written comments to Kevin Kunkel, that's spelled K-U-N-K-L-E, and the address is New York City Water Board, 59-17, Junction Boulevard, 8th floor, Flushing, New York, 11373. And the email address is kkunkel@dep.nyc.gov. And before we start the presentation, I just introduce the board's treasurer, Mateo McLean, and the board's executive director, Stephen Lawitz, who will be giving a presentation on the proposed rates for fiscal year 2015.
Speak now.
Or I forgot the sequence. Is it
Yeah, I think they go after.
after me? No, fine. Thank you.
Okay, so that concludes the introductory remarks. And
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Greg. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. I will, before getting into the arithmetic of the rate itself, just set a little bit of context about the water system, and since the proposed upstate rate is based on the estimated costs of delivering the water, how we arrived at that. And can everyone hear me? Yes? Okay, good. So we supply drinking water to about half the population in New York State, including New York City's 8.2 million residents. That was 8.2 as of the 2010 census. It's actually now closer to 8.4, and 1 million upstate residents. And as many of you know, it's an extensive system that began east of the Hudson with the Croton watershed as far back as 1842. And we have in total 19 reservoirs, 3 controlled lakes. We expanded west of the Hudson in 1907, and then we expanded west of the Hudson again between the 1940s and the 1960s. And we have 580 billion gallons of storage, which is about a year and a half supply, because New Yorkers, meaning those in the city as well as those upstate, consume about 1.1 billion gallons a day. We have very large capital needs for a system of this size, but as our capital needs have grown over the years to, in large part, comply with aspects of the Safe Drinking Water Act, as well as the Clean Water Act, which governs wastewater treatment, which is mostly an in-city expense. But you see on the red line are capital expenditures from 1985 to the present, and the blue line, which shows federal funding, as a percent of capital expenditures, has just about bottomed out over the years. So we have more needs, we have less federal funding, and federal requirements for safe drinking water largely affect expenditures upstate that drive the upstate rate, including the expenditures to avoid filtration. And you'll hear us refer to FAD expenditures for our filtration avoidance determination, as well as part of being able to avoid filtration, we had to provide a second form of disinfection for our water, and we built and we're currently operating the Ultraviolet disinfection plant, which we'll hear more about in a minute. And to kind of compound the effect on our expenses and on the rate, with changing interpretations in the city about what can be capitalized and what has to be expensed, we've seen more of our expenditures to protect the watershed having to switch from capital to expense over the last several years. And I think in the upcoming fiscal year, which begins July 1st, we have over $40 million of watershed protection related expenses that in former times we would have capitalized, but we now know we have to expense. And so those more immediately hit the cost and have a more immediate financial effect in terms of determining the rate. I mentioned our capital commitments, and driven by the two federal acts on drinking water and clean water, which is wastewater. The black portion of each bar represents mandated capital expenditures, those which we're required to do by federal regulations, which are usually administered by New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. They're enforced locally by the DEC. And you can see for the left side, which is the past, going back to 2002, that almost 2/3 of our capital expenditures, 62%, were driven by federal and state mandates. Going forward to the right, a much smaller percentage of our smaller capital program is being driven by mandates, and that allows us more flexibility to determine what our priorities are and what we spend our money on. So we can devote a lot more of our smaller capital budget to state of good repair and to building in additional capacity, and much less of it to meeting these federal requirements. However, we still have potential federal requirements and potential mandates looming out there. There is still in the federal regulations a requirement that surface reservoirs that hold treated drinking water be covered, and so the Hillview Reservoir, which meets those criteria, is still required by federal regulations to be covered, and our estimated cost for that is about $1.6 billion. We've been pushing back with the federal regulators. We've gotten them to defer our deadline for committing construction on that to sometime after 2020, but we're not exempt from it, and we're going to have to go back and try to renegotiate a further pushing out of this deadline or an exemption altogether, which we believe will be very difficult to get. I mentioned the Catskill, Delaware Ultraviolet Disinfection Facility, also known as the UV facility. It's been in service for over a year and a half. It's been a critical component of providing the drinking water, the world-class drinking water, to 9 million people a day. But it came at a rather substantial price of $1.6 billion. It has the capacity for over 2 billion gallons a day, which is about twice as much as New Yorkers currently drink, but as with a lot of DEP's infrastructure, we design it so that it is still useful and relevant far into the future. And I should mention that when we had Hurricane Sandy and when the water upstate was becoming very turbid, it was the UV plant that allowed us, in conjunction with discussions with our state regulators, the State Department of Health, that enabled us to continue to provide drinking water to all 9 million people without having to issue any advisories. Gilboa Dam, just as another example of a very large project, $390 million altogether for a multi-stage rehabilitation of the dam. And that is to meet current dam safety standards. And we have, I said it's several phases. We're going to be bidding out, as the last bullet says, the last two pieces of work in the next 2 fiscal years, fiscal year 2015 and 2016. The current phase of work, which you can see here in this aerial photo, is going quite well and is actually ahead of schedule by almost 2 years, which is a real testament to the contractor, because when this work commenced in the summer of 2011, it was disrupted in a very big way by Hurricane Irene, which hit upstate much harder than it hit in city. And we actually had an aerial photo, several of them taken immediately after the hurricane. And if you see kind of the base camp for the construction down here, that was all washed away initially, as well as a lot of large construction equipment. Water for the future, which is something that we've known going back almost 20 years, we would ultimately have to confront. There is a leak in the Delaware Aqueduct, which carries about half of our daily drinking water demand. And it's leaking in 2 sections, and we've known about it for about 20 years, and we've been doing a number of investigations and preliminary designs, and we finally came up with a solution to it that will enable us to permanently fix the Delaware Aqueduct with the least amount of disruption to the 9 million people that we serve. So we are going to be building a 3-mile bypass tunnel in the vicinity of the current Delaware Aqueduct, and the water will be able to go through the bypass tunnel. That will enable us to go in and permanently repair the leaking section and do it in a way that where we're not constrained by time and the need to get the original section of the Delaware Aqueduct up and running again in order to meet daily drinking demand. This project is going very well so far. We have under construction the 2 vertical shafts, one on each side of the Hudson River. And those are currently being bored. And we got a good bid on it. We had estimated that construction of the shafts would cost about $200 million, and the bids came in a little bit over $100 million. We will be bidding out the construction of the bypass tunnel itself in the fiscal year that begins July 1st. Hopefully we'll have similar experience with the bids on that work as well. And among other things that go into the calculation of the expense of providing the water is we need to protect the water system. I mentioned before the filtration avoidance determination and protecting the water system in the sense of buying land, keeping the upstate lands and the streams and so on that feed the reservoirs pristine, but we also have to protect and secure the water system upstate. So, we provide water to about 40 customers on a wholesale basis that represent 70 distinct communities. And there is a quantity that each of those communities is entitled to, and it's based on their certified population times the per capita consumption in New York City, and that quantity is called the entitlement quantity. And we sell water wholesale up to that quantity in each community at the entitlement rate. So it's the capital and operating costs of the drinking water. It excludes in-city costs, and then it's divided by the forecast consumption in terms of the gallons. And it's expressed in terms of a rate per million gallons. And then any quantities, and this doesn't pertain to every upstate community, but many of them exceed those entitlement quantities, and in cases where they do, that excess consumption is charged at an excess rate, which is set equal to the in-city rate for drinking water. So we take the cost, capital and operating, and we also reconcile, since we're looking at estimated costs each year and estimated quantities of consumption, we reconcile that with the most complete fiscal year, the most recent complete fiscal year. So for fiscal year 2015, the most recently completed fiscal year is fiscal year 2013. There's approximately a 2-year lag that we use, and we reconcile, and or it's also called truing up, and we use that to adjust the proposed fiscal year 2015 rate. So for fiscal year 2014, for fiscal year 2014, this is the rate that was adopted. It was a 12.3% increase over the previous year. This rate, which is how we currently project we will finish this fiscal year ending the end of this month, June 30th. And then our proposed fiscal year 2015 rate, the total cost of service, $622.5 million. We have a $4 million reconciliation from closing out fiscal year 2013. So that gives us an adjusted or net cost of service of $626.2 6 million. We estimate total consumption of, well, the way it's stated here is 398,000 million gallons, which is another way of saying 398 billion gallons. That results in an entitlement rate of $1,573.61 per million gallons, which is a 5.1% increase over the rate that's currently in effect. What makes up the cost of service? Debt service, which for the last several years has been the biggest piece of the pie. As you can see here in the red slice, that biggest slice, 41%. And real estate taxes, the second biggest. And for a large utility or any large operation, this is actually kind of an unusual mix of expenses here. Not so much on the debt service side, although we do have a lot of debt, but the fact that we pay more in real estate taxes and almost 40% more in real estate taxes than we pay in personnel costs. That is an unusual mix of expenses. But we pay real estate taxes to all of the upstate property taxing jurisdictions in which we own property. And then you can see on the chart here the other components: chemicals, contractual services, power. Here's the same information that was in the pie chart, and just in tabular form. And then again, calculating the rate, we have the cost of service of 626 million, the consumption of 398 billion gallons, and a rate of $1,573 per million gallons. Last year at this time, because we look ahead a year, we were projecting that next year's rate would be slightly higher, $1,583 per million gallons, a 5.8% increase. Instead, we're proposing a 5.1% increase, or 0.7 of a point less than our projection this time last year. This shows how it compares to the in-city rate. And so if you look at the proposed fiscal year 2015 rate, again, $1,573 per million gallons. The in-city rate for next year, as adopted by the Water Board at its meeting a week ago, Friday, May 23rd, is $4,946, which gives a net excess charge. That is the difference between the entitlement rate and the in-city water rate is $3,372.91 per million gallons. And just some selected upstate communities, so you can see how large or small a portion of the rate that is typically charged by those communities' water utilities to their retail customers, to their residential customers. And so just at the top, Carmel, where their retail is and this is for a calculated annual consumption of 80,000 gallons per year, which may or may not be typical of upstate consumption, but it is typical of single-family home consumption in New York City, and so it just provides a benchmark. But for Carmel, that would translate to a retail cost of $642 a year, of which our portion of that we would charge wholesale to Carmel at that $1,573, I'm sorry, the rate that's currently in effect, and 80,000 gallons out of 1 million gallons gets you $119. And the local utility, Carmel in this case, adds on $522, which takes care of their distribution and any additional treatment. So the New York City portion, the wholesale portion, is 19% of what the retail customer pays, and the cost that the town adds on comprise about 80%, 81% of what the retail customer pays. At the other end of the spectrum is, some of our larger customers, Yonkers and White Plains, where the total charges, again, for that same quantity of water, closer to $250, of which our wholesale charge is closer to half of what they charge the retail customer, and the additional distribution and treatment, if any, is about half of what the retail customer pays. And that's the end of my presentation. I will turn it back to Greg now.
Well, thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
And now the board's rate consultant, Amawalk Consulting, represented here today by Sean Lynn and Ed Marcus, would like to read a statement as to their preparation of the Upstate rate report. And I think, Sean, you're going to read? Okay. If you could just, the microphone is recording.
I am Sean Lin of the Amawalk Consulting Group, and I am here today to testify regarding the report on the cost of supplying water to upstate customers for the 2015 rate year that was prepared by the firm. For the record, I wish to state that the report was prepared in accordance with the methodology that was approved by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. The report illustrates the calculation of the cost of service for fiscal year 2015 and proposes a regulated rate of $1,573.61 per million gallons. The increase in charges over the current rate would be $6.15 for the entire year, or about 1 to 2 cents per day for a single-family residence, assuming 80,000 gallons a year of consumption per year.
Thank you, Sean. And our first, only registered speaker is Joel Dicker from Dicker Law.
Thank you, Your Honor. I have some extra copies if anyone would like to read along with my statement.
Yeah.
Good afternoon. It's good to see you all again. My name is Joel Dichter with the law firm Dichter Law, and I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. This office represents and offers its testimony On behalf of Upstate communities and distributors, including the Village of Scarsdale, the cities of Yonkers, White Plains, and Mount Vernon, towns of Greenberg, United Water Westchester, which serves the villages of Rye Brook, City of Rye, and the village of Portchester, as well as United Water New Rochelle, which serves New Rochelle, portions of Mamaroneck, Eastchester, Greenberg, Pelham, Pelham Manor, Tuckahoe, Dobbs Ferry, Ardsley, Hastings-on-Hudson, and Bronxville. And Westchester Joint Waterworks, which serves portions of Harrison, Mamaroneck, the village of Mamaroneck, and smaller portions of City of Rye and New Rochelle. I'll refer to this group as the Upstate Coalition or Communities through this presentation. Now, for 22 of the past 23 years, Upstate communities have been subjected to substantial rate increases. The Upstate rate report for fiscal year 2015, prepared by Amawalk Consulting Group, as we've just been hearing, shows an increase from $165 in 1994 to $542 in 2004, all the way up to $1,573.61 per million gallons for this coming fiscal year. For many years, the Upstate Coalition has questioned the cost of service for the supply of the system as a whole, and specifically with regard to the rates unilaterally imposed on Upstate communities, most especially the failure to follow accepted utility rate-making practices, accounting and rate-making practices, and the imposition of non-cost-based punitive excess rates. Even now, the rate report supplied by the Water Board and prepared by Amawalk is simply a summary document, with no work papers or support for the reasonableness of any expenditure. So we come here before you today for this public hearing required by law, no way satisfied that the annual increase is necessary or just. The cost of water supply has become a significant burden. The cost of water negatively impacts not only on residential users, but many small and large businesses in the entire local community of the Upstate communities, to the Upstate economy of the local communities, thereby negatively impacting the region as a whole. This is especially true when it comes to the so-called excess rate set by the Water Board. Unlike the entitlement rate that is established by the Water Board using a cost study, the excess rate is simply an arbitrary, capricious, penal rate. And the proposed rate for this year of $4,946.52 per inch, the excess rate is over 3 times the proposed entitlement rate. That goes way beyond any inverted rate design to promote conservation. Some historical background may give this more context to the unfairness of the excess rate. The New York State Water Supply Act of 1905 and subsequent amendments granted the city authority to develop the Catskill and Delaware watershed systems. In exchange for those developmental rights, New York City was required to deliver water to municipalities and water districts located within 8 counties north of New York City, which the Catskill and Delaware watersheds are located. The 1905 Act established entitlement amounts for each municipality and water district for water provided by the city. Monthly entitlement established each year based on the particular municipality's population multiplied by the daily per capita consumption in New York City. It's important to note that the nature of service that New York City provides to its upstate customers is strikingly different than that service it provides to in-city customers. Essentially, New York City provides only wholesale supplies of treated water to its upstate customers. From there, each municipality must plan, construct, and operate its own water distribution system, independent from New York City's distribution system, and independent from any other municipality's distribution system. Thus, while the customers of the upstate communities receive the same treated water that in-city customers receive, the cost structure for a majority of systems supply and delivery are very dissimilar. This is shown by your own table that you recently presented to us, showing comparing to various other communities. One thing I will say that is somewhat similar that you noted is that usage by residential households that are not apartment buildings, but single-family residences, tends to be somewhat similar, and the consumption tends to be somewhat similar, showing that there's not a great waste occurring outside the community as opposed to in-city, that they have similar usage and characteristics. In the past, the New York City Department of Environmental Protection has set the water rate for the upstate communities entitlement service on a cost-based basis. That is, each year, the DUP determines the cost associated with providing the wholesale service to to the upstate municipalities. Municipalities believe that it is a fair and reasonable approach to setting rates for the entitlement service. When municipalities are in sharp disagreement with the city is on the way in which DEP has traditionally set the rate for water deliveries to upstate municipalities that exceed the entitlement volume. For those excess water purchases, DEP prices them at the prevailing in-city rate. It's our understanding that the executive director has supported this approach by claiming that applying the in-city rate to excess purchases by upstate municipalities is fair because it falls within normal multiples for inclining block rates. I got this from watching the public hearing at the meeting of the water board, in which you always presenting this rate report. If this is DEP's justification for charging in-city rates for excess purchases by upstate municipal customers, it is right for fallacy. But I'll limit my comments only to the most important misconceptions. First, in the grand scheme of things, inclining block rates are relatively new. They've been adopted not because there have been significant change in the way in which utility services are being delivered, but rather inclining block rates have been adopted almost exclusively for road conservation. The notions of what constitutes a basic need for utility service and what constitutes excessive purchases will vary from one region to another, and from one utility to another as well. For example, the need to emphasize water conservation in communities within the arid desert region of Nevada is going to be considerably greater than in the northeastern states where rain is more abundant most of the time. Not that wasteful consumption of precious resource should ever be encouraged, but the point is that I'm trying to make is that because inclining block rates are used in different degrees by different utilities to encourage different consumption goals, there's no simple multiple for inclining block rates. More to the point, the DEP's use of an inclining block rate structure is not cost-based. The cost of impoundment and inadequate systems that are in place and used to carry water from the source of the upstate municipalities are largely fixed costs. Water essentially falls by gravity through high-volume, large-diameter transmission facilities to the points of interconnection with the various upstate municipalities. Except for water treatment-related costs, it costs New York City nothing more to deliver excess water purchases to upstate municipalities than it does to provide entitlement water purchases. In exchange for this relatively small incremental cost incurred by the city in making excess water deliveries, upstate customers are charged a rate, in-city rate, that is more than 3 times the cost-based rate. While the in-city rate is a cost-based rate for in-city service because it includes the necessary in-city delivery costs, which are not provided to upstate communities, it is not cost-based rate for service to upstate customers. In the rate report stated, pursuant to the Act, the cost of service methodology for upstate communities excludes all capital and operating facilities within the city in connection with the distribution of water within the city. This is not true for the excess rate. We're not here trying to get something for nothing. We realize that it may be appropriate to attach a premium to excess purchases beyond the entitlement values. We also recognize that an inclining block rate structure may be useful in promoting conservation, but charging the in-city rate is excessive and unwarranted. Moreover, as conservation is a worthy goal for upstate customers, it should at least be as worthy for in-city customers. Yet the DEP has routinely approved rates for in-city service with no conservation incentive. Given the relatively low incremental cost to New York City that are incurred in providing excess water supplies to the upstate municipal customers, I believe that a 3-time multiple of the ratio of entitlement rate to exit rate is excessive. Something on the order of 1.2 times multiple is more reasonable and in line with promoting conservation as opposed to a penal rate. Additional revenue to the city from excess is insignificant to the city in terms of the overall cost of the system. And I might add that the cost of providing excess, I believe, are already recovered through the entitlement rate, because all the costs go into the formula to determine what the entitlement rate is. That the impact on upstate communities is significant and growing, and thus pinpoints our greatest difficulty with it. Relief in the form of reduced excess rate significantly help the fellow citizens of New York State while being barely noticeable to the city. So we're pleased with the success of our face-to-face discussions, secondary allowance, on the excess rate, on the entitlement rate. We are frustrated and disappointed that our efforts to discuss and negotiate on the excess rate were rebuffed. The law itself speaks in terms of In the event the parties are unable to agree upon a rate, then the water board will set a rate subject to review by state agencies and the courts. There is no attempt to negotiate an excess rate. As a result, we've had to file a petition with the New York Public Service Commission to address the excess rate. We'd much prefer to negotiate a resolution with the New York City Water Board, but it takes two willing parties to do so. We are willing and hope the Water Board will come to the table to work on a non-litigated resolution of this issue. As for this year's entitlement rate, the percentage increase is down from last year, and that is appreciated. Though we know that next year's forecast it was increased by a higher percentage once again. We renew our request to provide us with full work papers and to follow standard accounting practices for utilities. As presented, we are provided a largely summary document, as I've noted before. It does not permit us to fully review the justness and reasonableness of the proposed rate. Nevertheless, we believe that some steps that can be taken to limit the increases without changing your determined level of cost of service by even $1. That centers on the rate-making treatment of cash used for either construction or defeasance of debt. For fiscal year 2013, the city included in the budget $150 million for cash used for these purposes. In fact, this city spent approximately $300 million during fiscal year 13, of which $45 million was allocated to Upstate. Consequently, the city is proposing to recoup that extra amount through the reconciliation of rate year estimates to actual expenditures. It is the largest reason for the additional cost added to the fiscal year 15 rate of about $4 million. We also posted a plan used last year of $225 million in cash to finance construction and fees bonds. Now we understand the city projects spending $400 million this year, of which $60 million defeasance of debt allocated to Upstate costs. And I'm sure you will seek to recover this amount through future treatments as well. The use of cash at such levels to finance long-term construction projects flies in the face of accepted rate-making principles that have been in place since the time of the Water Supply Act of 1905. The use of a large sum to finance construction results in the customers of today paying for the facilities used by the customers of tomorrow. In other words, this water plant has a useful life of 30 or even 50 years or longer. By recovering 100% of the cost of those facilities in a single fiscal year, the rates of customers for that fiscal year are saddled with the cost of providing water service long after many of them are no longer users of the system. If our recognition in this area had been adopted last year, the increase to Upstate customers would have only been 8% instead of 12%. This year, the increase This year, the increase is supposed to be lowered 5.1%. Prior to the decision not to use cash for these bonds. The Water Board treats water customers today as if they will be the same customers 40 years from now. The board needs to recognize that even though they may operate on a cash basis for accounting, even though they may have requirements that require them to use a certain amount of cash for these purposes, fair treatment of ratepayers or their customers means spreading costs across the useful life of facilities and across all those who benefit. Proposed rates should recognize that there are differences between accounting and rate-making treatments. Cash used for such purposes is to be spread out over the life of the facilities, or in cases of defeasance, over the period of savings on the debt retired. Implementing those differences will reduce the rates and burden on today's customers, including in this case. Lastly, we believe it is appropriate to include the additional, we believe it is inappropriate to include the additional cash expenditures by the cities for defeasance or construction or cash used for construction in the reconciliation or true-up. To do so undermines the basis of the true-up. Compare actual costs beyond the city's control with estimated costs. A decision by the city to spend more on these items is not related to costs outside the city's control. It does not belong in the true-up. In short, the increase this year can largely be avoided by implementation of effective rate-making practices. Thank you for your time and consideration. Any questions that you have to answer?
Thank you.
Okay, with no other registered speakers, would anyone else like to speak? This rate hearing is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.